G'day folks, it's Laura here, and today I'd like to show you how I painted this marbled velvet gecko on an acrylic pour background. I'll go step by step. So I actually paint a lot of acrylic pour backgrounds, and for example this is one that I completed fairly recently. And I do a lot of these so that I can have a lot to choose from when I'm looking for inspiration for a wildlife painting. So as you can see, this one was predominantly browns and there's a little bit of iridescent blue in there, and when it dried I decided it looked quite a lot like the bark of a tree, and I had taken a photo of one of these marbled velvet geckos and wanted to paint it essentially. And so I'll show you the step by step. But before I get to that, I just want to quickly show you the main paints that I was using and my general setup. So I started with a few of these kind of purple. So this is a dioxazine purple, a red violet, amethyst, and an Indian red oxide. And that's for the body of the gecko. I also had a bit of a background of Pacific blue, and you can see traces of it down through the side. And the speckles were predominantly with this beautiful yellow-green colour. Altogether I use a wet palette, which I just need to be very careful with here. Essentially this means that I can put my colours out and have them stay moist. These are acrylic paints, and usually acrylic paints would dry very quickly. But using a wet palette, so there's essentially underneath this layer of membrane, there is actually a foam mat and water. This wet palette essentially keeps my paints moist so that I can work with them for extended periods, which is extraordinarily helpful. I use mostly the Winsor and Newton 7 series, and just a range of different sizes of these brushes. A lot of the detail work is with the double or triple zero brushes, and some of the larger areas are with the zeros and the ones or two sizes. So I'll get into the time lapse step by step and describe for you how I actually painted this now. So I started this painting with a background base coat of that Pacific blue colour to add some opacity before I started adding texture to the gecko. Here I'm just adding some stippling layers, fairly coarse, using a rather large brush, and those purple colours, so the dioxazine and the red violet as well as the amethyst. And I'm just going up and down the body here to ensure that there's a bit of consistency across that, the length of that body. I did make a little bit of a mistake with the tail and the stripes on the tail when I first started, and so I will be going over those a little bit later. Here I'm adding some outlines to the whole gecko just so that it's easier going forwards not to accidentally overshoot. Once I have painted over the background with these acrylic pour backgrounds, I can't then take the paint off, so I need to be quite accurate in where I'm adding that paint to start with. So I moved on to doing a little bit of detailing around the face at this point. Wanted to bring out some of the beautiful blues and also using a fairly fine brush at this point, so tiny little stippling dots to add some delicate texture there. I started bringing out some of the highlights around the eyes, and I started thinking that maybe those eyes were just a little bit too small for a gecko. So its head didn't quite look fully like a gecko's to me at this point. While I was thinking about what to do about the eyes, I started adding the little dots, the patterns in the bright yellow-green, and I think this really adds a lot of personality to this gecko. Those stripes down its back as well as the little highlights, the little yellow dots. I added a little bit more of that coloured texture to the head here, but here's where I was really coming to realise that those eyes were just a little bit too small, and so I added a little bit more of a layer around the eyes, and I'm going to work on them a little bit when that dries. So here I am extending those eyes and making them quite a lot larger actually, so they look a little bit more like gecko eyes that are quite bulbous. Added a little bit more of that highlight around the eyelid of the eye, and then just darkening the eye altogether so that it stands out a little bit more and looks like a nocturnal creature, of course. Here I'm darkening in between those bright yellow spots and adding a little bit more definition to the stripes down the back. And we started on the neck and around the shoulders here with the little lacy kind of patterns in yellow-green. I'm really starting to like how this is turning out and adding a little bit of the shading to provide some of those skin folds around the shoulders. I think it gives the gecko quite a lot of character actually. So here I'm extending those stripes further down the back and using combinations of colours now. So doing a bit more of the blending and using some stippled glazing to actually combine colours on the canvas itself. So working on that forelimb now and just trying to deepen the colours before I add some more texture with the highlights. Here I'm adding those little spots to the arms, bringing them a bit to life and taking those spots further down the back. Now I decided that the spots actually should be slightly different colours regarding whether they were actually in the centre of the back or along the sides of the body, and so I started highlighting them in a more dull colour before actually making the centre spots much brighter with the straight yellow-green. And here's where I actually started adding some scale patterns, just using some white or some pale outlines, just adding circles essentially. And I quite liked that effect, and you'll see that I came back to that effect a bit later. I also had to modify that left forelimb a little bit because I realised looking carefully at the photo that I'd taken that the fingers were actually twisted up and one of those fingers was underneath, so that's why that changed. Here I'm adding a little bit more patterning and the stripes to the back, and I think it's the positioning of the stripes that really add a little bit more character to this gecko. So you can see just adding the little yellow dots, starting off with a paler, duller colour, and then I'll come back and I'll add much brighter yellow to that centre area. There you go. I decided then that the right hand side was actually probably more in the light than the left hand side, so I did add a highlight down that right hand side. Here I'm onto the tail and completely covered up the previous stripes because I wasn't happy with how they were. And the tail was also a little bit bluer than the rest of the body, and so I added a little bit more of a blue base there before adding some stippling for the stripe definition. And here's where I start to add those spots to the stripes and around the stripes. And I'm just adding them straight in a fairly bright yellow at this point. I'll add a little bit more colour to them. Here we go. And then adding some more patterning to the tail itself. I decided that I wanted a little bit more in the way of scales, and so here I'm adding some actual kind of blue scales, and I continue that effect a little bit up and down the center of the tail. And then I'm adding a little bit of shading around that tail, a bit more of the shadow on the left, a little bit of the lighter on the right hand side of the tail. And now I'm working on those hind limbs, just providing a base coat of colour so that I can come back and add those little dots which really bring the animal to life. So just adding some shading to the left hind limb. And it's around this point that I brought out the yellow right across the body, but then I decided to start adding some scale definition, and this is where I started drawing circles everywhere. And I really liked that effect of the circles, and it wasn't absolutely everywhere that I put them. I just put it on certain highlighted areas so that were very dark, and you could definitely see some of the scales. And so just adding a few more of those scales down to the end of the tail and through the middle of the body, and then a little bit up into the head and neck. Overall, I was really happy with that little scale effect at the end. I think it provides a little bit of interest when you get quite close to the image. So here's the finished gecko. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks very much for watching.